Hello and welcome to Broad History, a podcast about the history you think you know with women in it this time. I'm your host, Isabelle Rogol. The American Revolution, perhaps more than any other era in history, is known to us as a pantheon of great men that we've put up on literal pedestals. So if we want to recover the other half of history and understand American independence from the perspective of women who lived it, we should be able to rattle off their names: Eliza Schuyler, Phyllis Whitley Peters, Mercy Otis Warren, Deborah Simpson, Elizabeth Freeman, Molly Brand, as easily as we rattle off Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, Franklin. So for the next few episodes, we're going to look at a few individual women and see what their lives can teach us about the early days of the United States. Today, we start with perhaps the most famous of them all, Abigail Adams. And to talk about her, our guest is historian Woody Holton from the University of South Carolina, who wrote her biography back in 2009. Abigail was born Abigail Smith in Weymouth, Massachusetts in 1744. Her father was a liberal congregational minister who emphasized reason and morality, but also kept people in bondage. Her mother was descended from the great Quincy political dynasty. Abigail was smart and erudite, despite not having much formal schooling. She lived in a world of ideas and letters and friendships, and left a large correspondence which allows us to know her better than most women of her time. Abigail met John Adams, then just a country lawyer, when she was 15, and they had a patient courtship until they married 5 years later. She was the first Second Lady of the United States from 1789 and the second First Lady from 1797, though those titles weren't used back then. She was both wife and mother to two presidents, though she never got to see her son in the White House. She was also quite the capitalist with a shrewd mind for making money. That's where Woody Holton picks it up. Woody Holton, hello, and welcome to Broad History. You have a particular distinction of being the first man on this podcast, because I have to say it's quite rare to find male historians with an interest in women's history. I'm thrilled that it is the case, however, and I'm curious how you came to Abigail Adams.
Oh, well, fun question. And I'll start by saying I bite my tongue in making fun of my students who've suddenly gotten interested in Alexander Hamilton because of the play, because I realized that I kind of got interested in early America from a play called 1776. And Abigail Adams plays a very prominent role in that. So that was sort of in the back of my head. But for this project, as a scholar, I was not interested in her any more than anybody else. I was always interested in women's history because it's producing the coolest scholarship. And I was writing a book that I admit is pretty boring called Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution. And what makes it so boring is that a lot of it's about bond speculators. And it argues that people who had bought up soldiers' war bonds at pennies on the dollar were really indirectly the motive for the U.S. Constitution because it gave the federal government taxing authority to pay them off. It's a complicated argument. There's different versions of it. But I knew that this was going to be tough for readers. And I like having some readers outside academia. So I was looking for one of these guys that I could use as a stand-in for all the others. So he would be the person that you really get to know. And it was frustrating because I'd find one guy's in letters, another guy's out letters, a third guy's account books. And there wasn't one guy for whom there was really a ton of documentation until when I was about to give up on this idea of having one person to carry through my book. I found my guy, and he wasn't a guy. It was Abigail Adams. She was separated from her husband all the way from 1774 to 1784, a decade. A couple of visits in the early years, but then he was in France and visits were a little tougher. So she was separated from him for a decade, and she called it her widowhood, even though she was never actually a widow. She was emotionally miserable. She really loved John Adams. A hard thing to do, in my opinion, because the guy was so full of himself, but she managed it, and she missed him. But during that same decade where she's so emotionally miserable, or maybe because of that misery, She took over the family's farm and finances, as many women did while their husbands were off at war, or like John, off at Congress and off in France as a diplomat. She took over the family finances and she ran them much better than John, her husband, the future president, ever had. She wasn't a great farmer, but neither was John. It's not great soil up there. But she made him rich, by buying these bonds at pennies on the dollar. And the interest was figured on the face value of these bonds. So a bond that says is a $100 bond, you get $6 a year. Okay, $6, that's not a bad interest rate, fine. But she'd paid a fourth of the face value, so she's really getting $24 a year, a massive annual return, without touching the principal, which was eventually paid back at pretty close to face value. She made a killing off of these bonds. And she also, while her husband was over there in France, then as now, Americans believed that French fashions were the top of the world. And so she had him send her merchandise from France. And actually, Barcelona handkerchiefs were a big thing at the time, too. That was a women's wearing apparel. And because there was a British blockade, a lot of those shipments were captured by the British. But for the few that weren't captured, you could name your own price as a seller. And so she made a killing trading in this stuff. And she speculated in land in Vermont. There were 13 colonies, but there were trying to be 14 who rebelled. Vermont wanted to be the 14th colony, and New York said, no, you may not, because all that territory you guys claim is actually part of New York. So it was very much in flux, and that's the time to invest. And she did. She bought up hundreds of acres in the name of her husband, who was gone, and in the name of her eldest son, John Quincy Adams, who would later be president after his dad, and two other sons, and even in the name of her daughter, who was not yet married. And that's why Abigail could buy land in her name, because she's a femme sole, that is a woman alone. They're allowed to own property, but married women are not. So the one person in the family in whose name Abigail did not buy any of this Vermont speculative land that you buy at 300 acres a pop, the one person she didn't buy any land for was herself, because she couldn't, because as a married woman, she couldn't own property. But she made all this money for John, and it's not like he was shocked when he came home, because they'd been corresponding about it. But then the correspondence turns out to be really interesting, because John was conservative in a lot of ways. He wanted to declare independence from Britain, but he really admired the British government and thought that we should probably institute something like a king and something like a House of Lords here in the U.S., even after we declared independence. And he wasn't as bad as Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, I can't believe that he's become a sex symbol today, because at the time he was Mr. Patriarchal Conservative. He thought that we should literally have a king, that we'd elect him the first time and then he'd serve for life. And likewise, the Senate. I've got a brother-in-law who's in the U.S. Senate, and he would like this, I'm sure, on a personal level, because Hamilton's idea was that you elect senators and then they become the House of Lords and they serve until they die. And John Adams was not quite as conservative as Hamilton, but he's politically conservative. He was also personally conservative. And I'm sure you know about Gone with the Wind, but there's one line that didn't make it from the book into the movie that goes to a lot of that white Southern. When they're not thinking about slaves, they're thinking about land. And Scarlett O'Hara's father says to him, and I'm already a South Carolinian, but I'll go to the Georgia accent, land, Scarlett. Land's the only thing worth fighting for or dying for. It's land. And so you think of that stereotype that I just played as the opposite of John Adams, because he's up there in Massachusetts where everybody's pinching pennies and making money and moving into merchant trade and industry and all that. But John Adams had the same attitude. So whenever he had some spare money, he would write Abigail home and say, ooh, I hear Vesey's place, which is right next to my place, is up for sale. And I really want to buy Vesey's place. And she would write back saying, well, you can do that if you want, but you're only making 1% a year annual return on your land. And Vesey's place will be like that, 1% a year. And I can get you 20% a year or more on bonds. And so there's this wonderful debate.
Well, I'm glad we're starting there, because when I was reading your biography and, to be found, I wasn't super familiar with Abigail's life, but that's certainly something that I was not expecting at all. She is like this early American financial capitalist. That's quite a risk-taking attitude, right? Because bonds, it's sovereign debt. America is a new country. Who knows if it is going to keep faith and repay its debt at this point? It's very unsure. I thought that was pretty bold of her.
And what you were just articulating there, that's John Adams thinking. You're thinking like John. You got to think like Abigail if you're going to make any money here, because you're right. But because it's so risky, it's just like her importing those Barcelona handkerchiefs and nice stuff from Paris and Amsterdam. She once wrote him, "If 1 in 3 arrives, I should be a gainer." That is literally, I'm charging more than 4 times the normal price. And so if we can just get a few of these through. And John at one point said, let me send you, I've been sending these big shipments. One of them just got captured by the British. So let me start sending you a little bit here and there. And Lafayette was in Paris. He basically took the winters off during the American Revolution and went all the way home. It's a 2-month trip. Anyway, Lafayette was coming back to America, and John Adams set him up with some stuff to give Abigail. That was Abigail's chance to meet Lafayette. But my point is, he says, it'll be much safer if instead of sending you 1 or 2 big shipments a year, I'll send you lots of little ones. We'll spread the risk, which is, again, John Adams type thinking. And Abigail wrote back, a dutiful 18th century British world wife, and says, you're the master, and if that's what you want to do, that's what we'll want to do. But there's a problem with that. Sending these little packages here and there is that you don't have a warehouse. And so in order to send small packages all the time, you're going to have to buy retail. And it's all about buying wholesale at wholesale prices and then selling at retail prices. So her whole point was, yes, it's risky. That's what makes it so profitable. And then I also have to tell you that there's risk and then there's risk. If your husband is in Congress, we're dealing with this issue right now in the American Congress. There's a bunch of politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, who want to forbid Congress people from playing the stock market. And I always thought that was always the case. And the good ones, like my brother-in-law, they put their money into blind trust, so they don't know till they finish their congressional term whether they've lost money or made money. But the bad ones, absolutely. In fact, there's a stock index fund in the U.S. now.
The Nancy Pelosi index, is it?
Oh, you've heard of it? Yeah.
I've heard. Yes.
I wish I had money to spare, because that's where I would put it.
She has an impressive return for sure. I mean, nothing like the president's returns, but it's certainly.
Oh, if I could get Nancy Pelosi and Abigail Adams together, that would be a place to be a fly on a wall.
I would want to be in that room for sure. So we started kind of somewhere in the middle. Let's go back a little. Who is Abigail before even she's Abigail Adams? And how does she become this great capitalist? Is there anything in her background that brings her in that direction? I mean, she's the daughter of a vicar, right? Of a rector, I think.
She is. And we call them PKs over here, preacher's kids. And it's a stereotype of preacher's kids is that they are the wildest kid in the community. And we don't have a ton of evidence of her being wild in the sense that they are now. But she was, I think, wild in her thinking. And I think that can come, I've already told you, I've come from a political family. My father was also in politics, like my sister and her husband and so forth. And it can give you a feeling of entitlement and a blindness to your privilege. But one of the things that comes with that is self-confidence. I think it's so few records survive from that era, more from Abigail Adams than from most women by far. But even with her, so few records survive that we have to be very careful with our psychobiography of what made her so bold. But if I had to name one thing, and her father was her grandfather was the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Massachusetts. The legislature was the Massachusetts legislature, right? It wasn't Parliament. And so my point is, after the governor, her granddad was the top guy in Massachusetts. Her father was a preacher. Her mother was a preacher's wife, which was, and I think this is still true. I know from families I know where the husband or wife is a vicar, so is their spouse. And that was certainly true for the women of their time. You get 2 for the price of 1. If a church hires a married priest, he's getting 2 people's labor. And so the mom is out handing out hams to the widows in town and things like that. And so I think she got, it's a problematic term, but noblesse oblige, a little bit of sense of one must do what one can. And that's sort of modern liberalism. It's certainly not radicalism. There was nothing radical about either Abigail or John. But I do think that if you had to, gun to my head, if I've got to say what made her so self-confident, you would have to start with having a mom and a dad who were major figures in the community and a grandfather who was a major person in the community. The result of all of that is, I think you can sum up in a single word, and I'll be curious to see how this word crosses the Atlantic: saucy. That is, John and Abigail were constantly calling each other saucy. And that term survives in the U.S. today as sassy. He certainly had self-confidence too. I would say too much.
Probably a bit too much, yeah.
You got that impression as well?
Well,
yeah.
I don't know how much of my vision of Adams is Paul Giamatti in this series,
Right.
but that's kind of how I picture him in my head, and also having read your book and a few others where he shows up. And I think generally, same with Hamilton, same with Jefferson. Every time I come across them, I'm like, oh, these egos, which I guess you need to have done what they did, but
yes,
they're particularly prickly men sometimes.
Oh, prickly is a great word, because that's the one that pulls all those folks together. I should say that Abigail had a sense of that too. That is, she was as passionate as John was. And this was my biggest critique of I realize not everybody watching us has seen the HBO movie John Adams, but I could describe very quickly. Giamatti portrays John Adams as passionate, and Abigail sort of behind him, rubbing his shoulders. Calm down, John. She's soothing him. And they got that not from the written record, but from the 1950s TV shows. There used to be one called Father Knows Best, but it was really about Mother knowing best, because she soothes Father. She's home all day, of course, watching soap operas and vacuuming. And Dad comes home and he's all hot and bothered about something, and she calms him down. And that stereotype may or may not be true for the 1950s, probably not, because most moms were working too, but is certainly not true for the Adamses. Everybody that John Adams hated. And at various times, he hated John Hancock, definitely Jefferson, even Hamilton, who was in his political party once there were parties. Really, George Washington, although you couldn't say so. It's kind of like saying you hated God. But everybody that John Adams hated, Abigail hated more. So don't think of her as calm and soothing. She was just as passionate as he was. And the show completely misses that. It misses child raising too, because the kids completely followed orders from their parents, which, I don't know, the person in charge of that obviously had never had kids. But Abigail would go bed and snap. The kids would go dashing off to bed. No back talk. I realize it was 18th century, but actually one of the cool things, completely unrelated, and then I'll stop, is one of the cool things about them is they were both opposed to corporal punishment of kids, which they weren't the only ones who had that attitude, but they were very, very much on the cutting edge of that.
Well, that's not the question I was going to ask, but since you mentioned corporal punishment, that made me think of slavery. What was their attitude to slavery? Was slavery present in their life? It was for many of the founding fathers.
Yeah. John had very little experience of slavery ever, until maybe as president. There were a lot of slaves in Washington, D.C. He was president when the capital moved from Philadelphia down to Washington. So he started to experience slavery. No, and he had black workers. I think they were not enslaved in Philadelphia. But my point is, she's really the one to talk about here, because she was raised in part by slaves. There was one woman in particular named Phoebe, later married a man named Abdi, Phoebe Abdi, who, here's one of the most stunning comments from Abigail. Let's see. Slavery's abolished in 1783 by the same Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court that would later make Massachusetts the first state to legalize gay marriage, quoting the same phrase, all men are born equally free. How can we stop some men and women from marrying? Anyway, the Supreme Court in 1783 of Massachusetts, after a woman named Munbet, who she later changed to Elizabeth Freeman, she sued and got free in 1783. And then the precedent, that was earlier, but then the precedent gets set in 83. Anyway, Phoebe Abdi was freed in 1783, but by then she was old. And Abigail really took care of her. So Phoebe would come back from her garden or whatever and find a load of firewood on her porch or half of a pig. And that was Abigail. And it was, you could call it reparations. She'd done her own little reparations effort because she understood. Maybe she wouldn't have done this if Phoebe had been freed at age 20, but since she'd been freed at age 60, which was old back then, she felt a responsibility to her. Again, it rhymes with what she had done as a kid, going around with her mom to deliver charity to the widows and other poor folks. So on the one hand, she's got a somewhat patronizing attitude because she was the patron of Phoebe Abdi. On the other hand, after Abigail's parents had both died, her mother in a dysentery epidemic in 75, her father in 83, basically of old age, after her natural parents had died, she was talking about Phoebe Abdi in some other context. And Abigail referred to Phoebe as the only surviving parent I have. And you know, as a French speaker, that parent can mean something a little broader than mom and dad in French. So she may have been pulling from that. But either way, she's thinking of her as a relative. And I can tell you a story from the 1790s. Like Melania, she didn't spend a lot of time in the Capitol with her husband when he was president, partly because she was aware of malaria in Philadelphia and even more so in D.C. But anyway, she's up in Massachusetts and she writes John a letter. We're glad when they're separated because we get letters. But she's up there in Massachusetts and she has a servant boy. It's fair to call him a boy because he was quite young, but who was free but was black. And with her encouragement, he enrolled at the local primary school. The other kids, I had an experience like this 200 years later. The other kids in this school, the white kids, they had no problem with him. But their parents said, we're all going to pull our kids out of the school if you don't get rid of this black kid. And Abigail, James came and told her about what had happened. And she went and spoke with the schoolmaster and some of the parents and quoted the golden rule to them: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So she really kind of looks like Martin Luther King of the 1790s in that story. But now I got to take you back a little bit to 1784. Of course, Britain had abolished slavery long before we did in 1865. They did a court decision. Took a while for anybody to obey it, but of 1772 had abolished slavery in Britain 12 years before she got there. But she goes to Othello. And I think, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar, but I think one of the whole points of that play is bigotry is wrong. One of the reasons that Iago doesn't like Othello, is determined to bring him down, is who's this black guy who's advanced so much higher than me or whatever. So it's an anti-slavery and anti-racism, not even anti-slavery because slavery is not a story in there. It's an anti-racist play. And Abigail wrote home to her sister in Massachusetts, I could scarcely conceal my disgust at this sooty, S-O-O-T-Y, because black is soot, this sooty black man touching the fair Desdemona. And it was really that hand-to-hand contact. She had also that racist gene. And I think it may have come out in London because as an American abroad, she felt a need, and the ambassadors, unofficially, that's what he was, the ambassador, they called him first minister or whatever, minister plenipotentiary. Anyway, she's representing the United States in London, and slavery is an institution over here, and she hates it, but she feels like she's got to defend it. It was horrific what she said, but it's a challenge for all of us who write biographies of her. How can you, at the one hand, call Phoebe your parent and quote the golden rule to get your black servant boy back into this white school, and on the other hand, talk about the sooty Othello? So you tell me your interpretation. It's certainly out there waiting to be interpreted, how she could go to such extremes.
Reading you, I think she's just, none of us are immune from unconscious biases, and certainly not in her era. I think she's probably just absolutely swimming in this sea of racial prejudice, which even the most enlightened, it would be very hard to be completely free of it. And also, she doesn't seem very happy when she's in Europe. She certainly does not like French women very much.
Yes.
And she doesn't seem to be as open-minded as she might be about other things. She doesn't seem to be the way I'm reading it, particularly excited about discovering foreign cultures and foreign
Right.
people. And, she has a very, even though she is not a Puritan herself, I read her as a very American Puritan showing up in Europe
Right.
and thinking, what is this decadence in front of me?
As a French native, you'll be shocked to hear that there's a certain class of Americans who go to Europe so that they can come home and say, I never realized how much I liked the good old US of A until I was over there.
There's a whole class of French people who go abroad for the same reasons, I think.
Right. I brought that question up with students, and they've pointed out Othello was a soldier and the kid was a kid. And so I think there are a lot of people. It won't shock you to hear that I'm not big on Donald Trump, but I did notice the other day that one of my fellow South Carolinians, a car even more beat up than mine, had stalled out in the middle of the intersection. They happened to be black. And the guy helping him with the classic pickup truck and multiple Trump stickers happened to be white. So I think if you're vulnerable, you're going to bring out my belief in the golden rule. If you're powerful and carrying a sword or whatever, and she was right about Othello, by the way. He did end up stabbing his wife, and she knew the play by the time she saw it, so maybe that had something to do with
that
it
may be it.
too. That may have been more of a feminist statement than a racist statement.
There's also, and then we'll stop talking about Othello. I should probably know the play better to comment on it, but she's commenting on the relationship with the white woman, right? Which even in that era, and in many eras after, even the progressive, even the anti-slavery folks
Absolutely.
were not keen on mixed relationships, or there were plenty of abolitionists who thought that the freed Black people should just move to Africa, right?
Absolutely. Including Lincoln. He still said in the Emancipation Proclamation, so it didn't free a single slave. It only says in places that we conquer after this, we're going to free slaves. But then what are we going to do with them? Ship them off to Africa. It's in the Emancipation Proclamation that they'll be colonized, maybe in the far west, maybe in Africa. And the Quakers, to go back to my era, the 18th century, the Quakers were the only white friends that Black people had in the quest against slavery. But name a Black Quaker. There's hardly any, because the Quakers didn't want Black people in their faith. So you're certainly right. And I do think you're right also. Sex is the last thing to change. There's a wonderful Sidney Poitier movie called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And the older couple about my age are lovely liberals in every respect. They may have even marched in Washington in 1963, but then their beautiful Wonder Bread skinned white daughter comes home with Sidney Poitier. I mean, I would be thrilled if my daughter or son came home with Sidney Poitier, because he's him, but it took a little selling. And of course, the line is always, what will the neighbors say? No, I don't care, but what will the neighbors say anyway?
Okay, we've traveled all over history. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back to Abigail, and we'll come back to Abigail's correspondence and her most famous letter. But first, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Hey, it's Isabel again. Just a quick mid-roll break to say a huge welcome and thank you to new members of Broad History this week. Deborah, Katie, Adrian, Aaron, Tony, Lynn, Cynthia, Jason, Amy, Marcia, Kathleen, Julie, Peggy, Cheryl, Meryl, Jennifer, Beth, Tanya, Melissa, and Camilla. Wow. Your support means the world to me. There is no Broad History without you, so thank you. How do you get your name in the show? Well, it's easy. You go to broadhistory.com/membership and you sign up. For a few quid, bucks, euros a month, you'll get the podcast early and ad-free, priority access and discounts to events, merch, anything else I can come up with in the next few months as we grow. And you will be supporting independent writing and podcasting, research and storytelling into women's history. Your support right now, just as I'm getting going, is incredibly important, and I am so grateful for it. It's at broadhistory.com/membership. Okay, back to the show.
And we are back with Woody Holton to talk about Abigail Adams. Now, Abigail is famous for 3 words that have often been very misunderstood. And the words are in a letter that she writes to her husband, to John Adams. And so if you'll humor me, I will read it, but I will actually read a larger section of it because it is so often taken out of context. And then I would love your thoughts on what she actually means. So she writes, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. So she writes in March 76, like about 3 months before the Declaration of Independence. I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. And then she finishes with a bit of a softening. Regard us then as beings placed by providence under your protection and in imitation of the Supreme Being. Make use of that power only for our happiness. That's the full bit. And that's in a letter where she talks about spring is coming and we should be planting vegetables and news from home and news from the front. And it's all over the place. It's like there's journalism in there and there's just very mundane home talk. And then there's this. What is she talking about?
Well, first, I'm very glad that you read as far down into that letter as you did, especially going all the way to regard us as beings placed under your protection. It would never occur to me, I swear, I'm not a good feminist, but even I would never say to my wife if she was sitting over there, God has placed you under my protection. That's a reminder that I don't think we should call her a feminist, since that has a very 20th and 21st century meaning. I think proto-feminist is certainly fair and correct, particularly when we finally get to to her will, which we should save time for.
Yes,
but,
we will.
Good. We will get to the will. So I'm glad you got to the protection part because we don't want to overdo this. And actually, another picture of it that I picked up writing the book was this woman never in her life rode a horse. Lots of women rode horses. Enslaved women knew how to ride horses in many cases in the South. And I don't know why she didn't. I think she thought it was not ladylike enough. And so it just shows how complex we are, that somebody who was such a forerunner in so many ways was also 2 steps forward, and then there's that 1 step back. So I'm glad you got down there that far, but the thing I'm really glad you got to was the vicious and the lawless. She later threatens rebellion and all this. There's a lot of fun stuff in there, and she, as lots of scholars have pointed out, she takes a lot of John's own phrases and throws them back at him. That is, he'd used them against the British. All men would be tyrants if they could. That's a standard part of the sort of political psychology of American patriots or American rebels against the British, that there's a natural tendency to be tyrannical. And so they're worried about being the victims of that tyranny. And she's pointing out, well, wait a minute. When you say men, I think you meant, or you could have meant, should have meant men in the sense of male. All males are naturally tyrannical. So there's lots of clever things. There's even fun things. And the threat to rebel is the most fun of all. But there's really serious business going on here, and that is spousal abuse. And I wish I could take credit for it, and I wish I could remember who. It may have been Elaine Crane, but one of the other Abigail biographers was the first to really point this out, that it's really about the vicious and lawless. There's 2 kinds of men, and she's partly daring to prove that he's in the good kind. But then there's this other bad kind that tyrannize over their wife to the extent, and she doesn't. It would be going too far to be too explicit and say men who hit their wives. But I was persuaded, once you hear that, you can't unhear it, I think, in everything she's writing in that letter. And then the same scholar that I'm remembering, and I'm pretty sure it's Elaine Crane, also points out, really sadly, that there was an alcohol gene, they didn't use that language at the time, in the Smith family, that is her family, which results in the death of 2 of her 3 sons, who basically died of alcoholism. And it also was a terrible problem for her brother, William. He had a bunch of kids and couldn't take care of them. And so they were farmed out to other families. And so the wife had maybe no say in that. But alcohol and a form of abuse. There's no evidence. I really want to be sure to not libel William Smith because there's no evidence of him physically hitting his wife, but he certainly emotionally abused her and may well have physically abused her too. And so this public statement that's quoted on every statue of Abigail, and rightly so, had a very personal side to it. The nothing can be more intimate than spousal violence, but then even more personal than that, if this other scholar is right, that it's really about her own brother. So you start from that, and it is amazing that she can go from that to kidding around about rebelling. But as I think students have also pointed this out to me, that there's joking and then there's joking. And she is kidding around, but she kind of had to kid around to soften the claim.
Yeah. I think with that interpretation, which I hadn't heard and was like really kind of a lightning moment for me when I was reading your book, because with that interpretation, now I reread this letter and I find it so incredibly modern, right? Because we're talking about domestic violence and femicide a lot nowadays. It's a big part of women's battles, but also in the way that she is softening the blow. There's almost a bit of a not all men thing there, being like, I'm not talking about you, but I just found it really interesting. The thing that she's not talking about, which is often how Remember the Ladies has been interpreted, is the vote, right? Did she ever want the vote? Was it
so
not
glad
even,
you raised
was
that.
it just
Absolutely
out
not.
of even consideration at the time?
Well, the one way I'd say it's not out of consideration, she does complain there that women are not represented in
laws
in the
without
government.
no voice of representation. Yeah, she does.
Yes, absolutely. And she writes another letter in June of 1782 that is very sad, not feisty or saucy like much of the tone of this letter, where she really goes into complaining about women being taxed and having their sons taken away to war and all that, and not being represented, not having a vote. But she never went beyond complaining about it. Demanding a change to that was still beyond the pale. It was still beyond the pale for the majority of the people at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And it was only because Frederick Douglass stood up and agreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others at the convention in saying that this is the right upon which all the others are based, that we got to ask for the right to vote. So that's what I'd say in her defense. At 72 years later, it was still unthinkable. It's not that people didn't want it. And there were anonymous pieces in the newspaper. Judith Sargent Murray was saying, why shouldn't women vote? There were things out there, mostly anonymous things. But for Abigail, it was too much to ask for. And even though she's talking about the most horrible thing, spousal violence, she can do it with that threat to rebel. But the one problem with threatening to rebel is John knows she's joking. And so he writes back saying, I cannot but laugh at your feminine propositions. And as Cokie Roberts was another biographer of Abigail Adams, a big NPR person, and she used to say, Abigail must have wanted to kill him. And I'm sure that's true. And so that's the problem. If you do something, if you put the joke in there to soften it, then that's an opening. It's like playing bridge. Well, if I play the 7 of spades, she's going to play the 8 of spades. And he did kind of trump her there.
I thought that too when I read it. I thought we've all, it's one of those moments where I felt 250 years apart. I felt I could relate entirely to Abigail's experience, which is, how do you deliver the feminist creed that you want to deliver, but you soften it so that it doesn't rankle, but then you make it serious enough that people don't respond with a joke, and then opposite you, you have someone who laughs it off. We've all been there. So I thought I really related with that. I think the one thing that she's quite consistently very vocal, and more so than the vote, clearly, throughout her life, is education, is girls' education. Because I think people connect her to the vote, connect her to Remember the Ladies. Actually, it's girls' education that I think she's most passionate about. What is the problem that she sees?
First, let me just say how much I agree, just because if you were to try to do it statistically, she mentions spousal violence, if we're even right, and I think we are, about that once that I can think of in all of her 2,000 surviving letters. And she mentions education all the time. she clearly was pissed off that she had a cousin who went to Harvard, and she wrote him saying, "I wish I could go to Harvard, and tell me everything you learned in algebra class or whatever." And that was probably another little joke that he took as a joke, and so he didn't teach her a damn thing. But we also shouldn't go too far into thinking that she was uneducated. You read the letters, you can tell she's very educated. Being on your talk show reminds me of a talk show, an all-night talk show I was on in Denver, Colorado one time. So at 3:00 in the morning, some guy asked me, "Oh, what would Abigail Adams have thought about 9/11?" And I actually had an answer
Oh,
about
wow.
9/11 because she knew something about Islam back when they were courting, and their courtship letters. By the way, all these letters are available online for free, and I really recommend them to people. Just to Google Adams Electronic Archive.
Yeah, I'll link to that.
Anyway, oh, thank you. In one of the courtship letters, she said, "I wish I could fly to you on the wings of Albarak, of the Albarak of Muhammad." And I go, "What?" So I, of course, had to look it up because my knowledge of Islam and most religions is pretty thin. But that's how Muhammad traveled up to heaven, was on an Albarak, a flying horse. And so she once again, not for the first time, beat me in classic knowledge. And that's because she read the newspapers where there would be excerpts from the it was hard to come up with enough stuff to put in a colonial newspaper before the revolution. I think one reason they fought the revolution was so they'd have some American news. And so they mostly had
War has
news,
always been great for newspapers.
and for Americans learning geography, yeah. But anyway, they would stuff poems and history of Russia and all this stuff. You could learn that stuff from the papers, but also her grandfather had a huge collection of books, which she was known to have consulted. But to me, the most interesting thing about her education is the letters she wrote her peers, and especially female cousins, where they would say, "Oh, I've just read," she would say, "You'll like this as a French woman. I've read Moliere and he's so dirty. It's terrible. I hate it. I had to keep reading, because
See
it
why
was
I think
so."
she's a Puritan?
Yes,
You can't
exactly.
hate Moliere. Come on.
Right. Yeah. Well, by her standards. And as I say, I had to keep reading, she says. And then her friend would write back, say, "Yeah. And I find Chesterfield even worse." There's a guy named Lord Chesterfield who basically wrote advice to young men on how to seduce young women. She hated him. The only thing she ever published in her lifetime was by accident. She sent somebody else's denunciation of Lord Chesterfield to a Boston newspaper with an introduction, and she didn't mean for the introduction to be printed. That's her one publication out of all the great stuff she wrote. Anyway, my point is, these letters that she wrote back and forth with her female friends and cousins, you'd think, "Oh, well, how far away did that cousin live? 3 colonies away, 3 towns away?" No, she lived next door. They're writing letters to practice their skills. So I would not describe her the way you would describe Ben Franklin as self-educated. I would call her socially educated. They're not self-educated, they are mutually educated. And she did get far enough to know to write a mean letter, although in terrible handwriting, in my opinion, and terrible spelling. One of the few things that she was really insecure about was her spelling. But everybody spelled poorly in those days, so that's not a very good thing to worry about. But she also was educated enough to know how uneducated she was, and was determined to rectify that for herself. And so while she was in London, she attended lectures. And in Philadelphia, she would go to, I think she went to some dissections. She went to watch Congress. Although the one time she went to watch Congress was when they were voting on whether the bond speculators or the soldiers who'd actually done the fighting were going to get the windfall at the end of after the Constitution was adopted and the federal government had tax money to spend. But much more generously, she was constantly pushing young women to take opportunities to get educated, and pushing men to allow women to attend their lectures. Public lectures were a big thing. This is back in the day where if you lived in New Haven, Connecticut, even if you had nobody, or near New Haven, even if you had nobody in the graduating class, you would still go to graduation for the pure entertainment. And so, yes, I agreed. That's the biggest thing she pushed in her letters for women, was education. Because, of course, if you have education, then you can battle the other things and maybe ultimately battle for the vote.
And in that way, I think she prefigures a lot of the feminist battles of the 19th century, right? Because it very much becomes a theme. You say women can't do this, you say women can't do that. Well, of course, nobody's teaching them. No one is born
Absolutely.
with those skills, right? You have to develop them. And so you're keeping women as, eternal children, not just legally, but also by refusing to develop their intellects.
Absolutely. That's all over the Seneca Falls resolution. Women can't do this because they're uneducated. And by the way, we're going to keep you uneducated.
By the way, you can't be educated. Yes, you're not
Right.
allowed in universities
Exactly.
and schools, etc. There's two things I want to talk about. Well, one thing I want to talk about before we talk about her will, which I promise you we will, is that she is the first lady to move to Washington. She lives in the White House briefly.
Yeah. Or you guys burned it down.
Sorry.
We're still very bitter about that.
We've each done some things we regret. What does she think of it? What does she think of life in Washington and of life in federal politics, which John dragged her into?
She hated the White House. It was unfinished. They moved into a fixer-upper. It had been built, but not furnished, and it leaked and all that stuff. And like all the first ladies after her, that's part of her job. We'll see whether AOC's husband also takes care of the plumbing in the White House when she's president.
Are we opening bets on AOC then?
Yeah, I think that's a different website. So she hated that part of the job. She was exposed to slavery in a bigger way than before and became more opposed to it than ever before, I think. And she was aware that it was a malaria trap, being a swampy southern area, and didn't like it for that reason. And I think I'm doing a book on disease now, so I'm noticing the disease is the thing behind so many things. So she was not a happy camper in Washington. Yeah, and she didn't like seeing people saying horrible things about her husband. One of the questions that I disappoint people as the most frequently asked question of a Abigail biographer probably is, what influence did she have on her husband? And on his politics, I have to say, not much. She tended to be more extreme than him. One of his low moments as president was the Alien and Sedition Acts, putting congressmen and newspaper editors in jail. And it actually happened for criticizing him and his administration. And of course, there was a war to justify it, a war against the French that took place only at sea between 1798 and 1800. But he got a lot of criticism, rightly so. I think most of us agree, for signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, but she thought they should be tougher because she was quite the partisan. Yeah, we haven't had time to talk about things I don't like about her, but just tick off a couple of them. One was that she was an absolute partisan. She was a hater, to use internet language. And she also didn't allow two of her kids to marry the person they truly loved. And this was a time when the kids were getting control over who they married, and they weren't arranged marriages. And so technically, if they'd pushed harder, but she had the force of all of her power and deployed it against both John Quincy and Nabby, her daughter, marrying the right person. And that was sad. The place where she did have the biggest influence on her husband, to go back to that, is the will. So if you're ready to talk about that, we can wrap up on that.
Yes, we can wrap up on the will.
All right, so remember that John, when Abigail wrote him in 1776 saying, "Remember the ladies," he wrote back saying, "I cannot but laugh." So that's the basis for people like me saying she didn't influence him much. And she didn't in the terms of actual laws getting passed. But you'll also recall by saying early on that she made a killing for him in all sorts of speculative and some of them unscrupulous ways. And all of that money, because she's married to him, is his money to do with. If he'd had a mistress, he could have spent it all on his mistress because it's his money, even though she earned it. And that was one of the great forms of oppression that lasted for centuries and did not end in 1776 with independence. The 13 states all continued to follow the English common law. It was only when we started to bring in states like Louisiana and Mississippi, which had a little bit of a French history to them, and then later Texas and Florida and so forth, that women started to own property. Eventually we get, starting in 1839, married women's property laws. But that's way in the future. That's long after she died. And so she was not allowed to own property. But here's the great discovery that caused me to say, I have to write this book. And that is, she's not allowed to own property as a married woman. She did it anyway. She took some of that money she'd made for her husband and set it aside. She called it my own pocket money. And tellingly, this money, which I call mine, because she knew legally it wasn't, but she used it for things her husband didn't normally approve of, like supporting Phoebe more than he would have wanted her to, and for Oh, she used it to bribe her kids to move closer to her, which if my parents had that much money, they probably would have done.
Typical mom.
Hey, don't worry about work. There's a mansion you can have if you'll just move next door to us. I can relate to that now that I've got kids of my own out there. She used it for interesting purposes, but she also held on to a bunch of it so that in January 1816, when she thought she was dying, she had it was $6,000, but you can probably multiply that times 20 to get a sense of what it would buy today. She still had that much to write in her will. And in her will, she had all of these nephews and sons-in-law and grandsons and so forth who were really in bad financial shape. The 19th century was ups and downs in the economy, and a lot of them were in the real low stages. And she left these guys nothing. She left it all to her nieces, her daughters-in-law, her granddaughters, and even to her female servants. She left it all to women. But that's not even the most surprising thing about it. The most surprising thing about it is that she wrote that will at all in 1816 because her husband was still alive. He famously died. Oh, we're about to celebrate the 150th anniversary. I'm sorry, the 200th anniversary of John Adams' death on July. It'll be in the past tense for people watching us because it was on July 4th, 1826, same day as Jefferson. So my point is that her husband died after her, so there was no reason to write her for her to write a will, and she had no right to write a will either. And she was aware of that. She wrote, I, Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, by and with his consent. And that changed everything. Even though he didn't sign it or anything, she claimed that he had approved it. And then it was up to him after he found this will in his wife's papers. He would have been completely within his rights to just throw it in the fire because he was the master of the house. But what he actually did was comply with it to the letter. And to me, that almost makes up for him saying, I cannot but laugh at your feminine proposals, because within their own household, he was acknowledging that even though English common law is still operative in America, didn't give her the right to own property and write a will. There was a moral right which she insisted on and which he acknowledged. And to me, that was their most fascinating collaboration.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tenderness to that final act in both John Adams and their sons and male relatives not fighting this, in acknowledging her ownership and her decision, and in her continuing, because for her whole life she cared for a lot of relatives, and in her death she continued to care for all the women in her life, which I thought was a very beautiful ending to her life and an ending to our conversation. Thank you so much, Woody Holton, for taking so much time to help us know Abigail Adams so much better.
Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I told you I've had certain questions that I always get asked, but you didn't ask me any of those. So these are all new questions, so it made for a really fun conversation. So thank you, and I enjoyed it.
That was Woody Holton. You'll find his book, Abigail Adams, A Life, in the Broad History bookstore, as well as his latest, Liberty is Sweet, where he continues to expand who we think about when we think about the American Revolution. If you look closely at the cover, the patriot pointing their gun at two redcoats is actually a woman in disguise. The bookshop is linked in the show notes, as always. If you don't subscribe already, sign up for the newsletter and read the articles at broadhistory.com. This week, I wrote an explainer on coverture, the reason why married women like Abigail Adams could not own property. There's more background on the women we talked about last week with Carol Birkin, women like Deborah Sampson, Lady Dara, Sybil Ludington, and Molly Pitcher, and also why it's so difficult to even know the truth of their lives. And there's some great illustrations too by a Broad History listener, Heather Rogers, who doodles American presidential history. It is great fun. It's all at broadhistory.com, where you can also opt to support the show and get every episode early and ad-free by signing up for membership. And finally, if you enjoy the show, and you must have if you listen this far, please go and nominate it for Listener's Choice in the British Podcast Awards. And no, you do not need to be British to vote for this particular British election. It is britishpodcastawards.com/voting. I haven't won an award since college, and I'd kind of like to. Thank you so much. This has been Broad History, a podcast about the history you think you know with women in it this time. I've been your host, Isabelle Rogol. Music by Aaron Kenny. I'll talk to you next week.